Hey, Mike.
Ryan, how are you?
Good to have you with us. So to my friends who will be watching this later at Hunter Hills, this is Mike Cope. Mike is, I consider him one of my mentors, whether he considers that or not to be the case. He is on the list of people I call when world pandemics happen and how do you minister through these times. And so rather than this being a private conversation just for me to enjoy, I wanted you all to learn from Mike. Mike is currently the Director of Ministry Outreach at Pepperdine University in Malibu. He resides in Abilene, and I think he's ministered in North Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, California a little bit. He's from
At
Missouri.
Pepperdine, yeah.
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 Yeah, so thanks for agreeing to do this with us.
Yeah, I'm a pandemic expert here. The training we got in seminary in the late 70s and early 80s for how to deal with a pandemic was exquisite. So,
yeah, did they train you in technology then as well, like Zoom?
no, I did have a Selectric that would erase one letter at a time. So I was ahead of the curve. Yeah.
I'm going to Google Selectric when we're done here and learn what that is.
Yeah.
So the first question that I'm wanting to ask you and wanting people like myself, we're thinking about this. Some of us are stranded at home. Some are still going to work, though that looks differently. I think of people like my wife who is literally stuck at home with children 24/7. How are people, what are your recommendations to stay grounded and spiritually grounded, and what practices ought we lean into?
It's a great time for us to rely on the knowledge of the church through its history. Because honestly, the church has lived in traumatic times for much of its history. Much of my life has not been spent that way because I was born a decade after World War II. But we have known that there are some rhythms for healthier living. For Pepperdine, I lead a Lilly endowed project called Thriving in Ministry. So one of the things I get to do is work with ministers on how to try to be a healthier leader of a congregation. And I love the quote from Peter Scazzero that the healthiest thing you can do for your church is to be a healthier leader. Mm. And so we work on four things. One is emotional maturity, to try to learn to be a non-anxious presence.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing right now because some of us are by inclination a little more anxious than others. And so we have to develop skills of calming and self-talking and mindfulness. We have to learn not to catastrophize. Mm. And so this is an important time for me as a leader in the midst of a system to try to break through some of the high anxiety by playfulness and calmness. So that's one. A second is I have to practice self-care. Even for those who are stuck at home and it doesn't seem like there's any end, you have to practice rhythms of rest, of Sabbath, of eating right, and getting out to walk, even if it's around the backyard. Doing those things we know tend to calm a person and provide a greater sense of well-being. Third, you have to practice relationships. And that's why a lot of people are finding, even if it's over a phone call or over one more Zoom meeting, you have to find your buddies. You've got to find your friends, your girlfriends, your guy friends, and connect with them in a way that's life-giving. There has to be some place where you can tell somebody your own fears and where you can have fun. Yeah. And then the fourth area we focus on is contemplative spirituality.
Yeah.
So I was raised where coming up with prayer on the spur of the moment is the best way to do it. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work in life during high stress times. It's better to live in a rhythm where I can count on it, where I know, for example, for me, every morning I pray the Psalms. Each day I pray a different Psalm and the Lord's Prayer. I've come to really love what we call the prayer of St. Francis, probably not from St. Francis himself, but the idea, especially in a pandemic, that where there is something painful and hurtful in the world, I will try to respond with the love of Christ. So that's my brief encouragement to people, is to step into the rhythms of contemplative spirituality and life-giving relationships and self-care. Yeah. And on top of that, just as much non-anxiety as possible, a calming presence.
Yeah, so the St. Francis prayer for everyone is the Lord, make us instruments of your peace, which would be a great prayer for us to pray daily through this time. That's a good advice. Um, I look around and churches are obviously in a different space than we have ever been in America. My lifetime, which is only 36 years, I've only not been able to go to church once or twice because of snow. I've never been in this season. What do you think churches are learning right now about ourselves?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly traumatic for our model of church, for what we know in the United States and most of the West, because we tend to live apart from persecution. That we like to
Right.
talk a lot about persecution, but that kind of actual persecution that churches are facing in much of the world today, we have been sheltered from. So it's given us the comfort to define church largely as the church gathered.
Hmm.
So historically, as you know, the rhythm was the church gathered and the church scattered.
Right.
And there was a kind of rhythm there. And there was the Hebrews 10 wisdom of encouraging one another when the church is gathered, and the Hebrews 3 wisdom of encouraging one another daily, as long as it's called today, because the church is scattered through the week. But because we live in an entrepreneurial time and a time that likes measurements, our focus has been on the church gathered. And I think now we're feeling the importance of that, of the people together. We miss it. And we'd love to be together and see one another, hold each other, sing together. But part of what this is doing is forcing us back out into a keen sense of the church scattered, that we are still the people of God. We're the followers of Jesus Christ in the highways and byways of life. And so there may be some repercussions that are healthy for the church. And that would be such a God thing to play a card on top of all of the other cards that moves this in a healthy direction. That doesn't describe God sending pandemic or anything like that, but God has a way of using things as we are learning new ways of caring for one another. And some of our attention is from nailing worship to authentic community and authentic discipleship. Maybe it's going to move us back into another place. And by the way, what I have been, as I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of ministers over the last few weeks through Zoom and private calls and so on, I have a sense that those in smaller churches have kind of been ready for this. They already have a sense of what it means to be a missional outpost of the kingdom. Now, that's not to the exclusion of larger churches. I know a lot of them that have that as well. But there's something that every church can lean into right now to say, we are not defined by the number of people who walk in a door on Sunday morning or by how excellent people may think our worship assembly is. As important as all of those things may be, who are we as the people of God as we live out in this world? And right now, our people are finding new ways of connecting with neighbor, new ways of loving neighbor as yourself.
Yeah, I think about our Church of Christ story as well, that the priesthood of all believers is finally having a good moment to be alive. It doesn't matter how qualified you think you are or someone has said you are. I've noticed in our church, people are shepherding each other right now, everybody. And that's a beautiful thing to lean into. So,
I've spent my life as a pastor, but here's my younger son who's had to take a subway to Brooklyn to make sure some children under his care are okay. I have a son who's a physician who's got to put on a mask and go to a place that doesn't feel safe to me. And so now suddenly and my wife, who is a school teacher, who's still learning new ways on the internet to see her children, her fourth grade kids, and to be able to teach them there is time. And yet people call me the minister. Now we're getting a keen sense that all of this is ministry. What I do is, what you do is, but what your wife does, what our families do, that is all ministry too.
That's great. So with that, and this is the last question, well, almost the last question. You kind of hinted at this, and I know we're not prophets here, it's just a guess, but as we're learning, and I'm confident that we're going to see some changes that I hope, being optimistic, are for the better in the church. But how do you suspect, what's your hunch of how the church should or could or will change through this in the future? I don't think we're going to flip a switch and go back to normal anytime soon. So
That seems very unlikely.
yeah.
First of all, because we all know this is probably the first wave of what will be
Mhm.
several waves, and it's forever going to force us to come to terms with what Bill Gates said several years ago, which are that our ultimate enemy is going to wind up being not a war but a pandemic in terms of national security.
Right.
But I think what it may do for the church is put us in a place where a kind of raw, authentic discipleship is moved to the front. That we now have to think again of what it means to be people committed to following Jesus Christ, who on Palm Sunday walks in not on a white steed to the top of Mount Olympus, but on the back of a donkey into Jerusalem and is crucified on Good Friday outside the walls. So it's taking us back into the narrative
Yeah.
that lies behind Christianity. Nobody would wish this on us.
Right.
But again, the way God may use this is to lean us back into the deepest narrative. And that feels to me like what Paul, as a shaper of pastoral care in his churches, was trying to do, was help people live in the rhythms of the Christian narrative.
Yeah. That's great. So last question, you've never been to Prattville, Alabama, I don't think. You've been to Montgomery, and we're kind of a suburb of that. But given what little you know, what's your word of encouragement to the Hunter Hills Church in Prattville?
Yeah. I would say that it is a good time for people to explore what joy looks like that's not tied to exciting parties and gathering with friends at a restaurant. It's a great time to explore the deepest source of my joy, the kind that Paul says in Galatians 5 is created by the Holy Spirit, the kind that the Apostle Paul remarkably had despite all of the things that he went to. And if we can reach down, deep down into the kind of joy that comes from the gospel and from our relationships with others, there'll be a kind of unique witness that comes through this.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, Mike, I know you're very busy, especially now, reaching out to so many people. So thanks for taking the time.
Sure.
To share
Love
this
you and Sarah and the kids. You guys take care.
Y'all too. Thanks, Mike.
All right. Bye-bye.